My daughter-in-law called me a financial drain on a Tuesday evening. By Thursday morning, I had transferred every asset I owned and walked out the front door of my own house for the last time, and my son never saw it coming. My name is Harold Mercer, and I spent 41 years building something from nothing in Asheville, North Carolina. I want to be very clear about that 41 years. I was not handed a single dollar. My father was a mill worker who died at 53 with calluses on his hands and $12 in his wallet. My mother cleaned houses until her knees gave out. I watched both of them work themselves into the ground, and I swore I would do better. Not for pride, for survival. I started Mercer contracting out of the back of a used pickup truck when I was 26 years old. 1 truck, 2 employees, and a business license I paid for with money I borrowed from my uncle and paid back in 3 months. By the time I was 50, I had 32 employees, a fleet of vehicles, and contracts with 3 county governments. I built schools. I built bridges. I built the kind of things that stay standing long after you are gone. I also built a house. Not a mansion. A real house, 4 bedrooms, a wraparound porch, a yard that backed up to a creek where the herons came every spring. I built it with my own hands on weekends over the course of 2 years. My wife, Susan, planted a garden along the south fence. She put in roses and tomatoes and a fig tree that took 4 years to produce a single piece of fruit. When it finally did, she called me outside at 7 in the morning to look at it like it was something miraculous. That was the kind of woman she was. Susan died 6 years ago. Ovarian cancer, 14 months from diagnosis to the end. I was 61, and I did not know what to do with myself after that. The house was too quiet. The garden started going wild because I did not have the heart to tend it the way she had. I kept the fig tree, though. I watered it every week because it felt like the last thing she had asked me to take care of. My son, Derek, was 34 when his mother passed. He had moved back to Asheville 2 years earlier with his wife, Brianne, after a job in Charlotte fell through. I let them stay in the house while they got back on their feet. That was the phrase we used, get back on their feet. I did not put a time limit on it because Derek was my son, and I believed in giving family room to recover. Brianne was a woman who had strong opinions about everything and softened none of them for anyone. She had a particular talent for making generosity feel like debt. When I paid for their groceries, she thanked me in the tone of someone cataloging an obligation. When I fixed the plumbing without being asked, she said, "Well, it is your house," in a way that made it sound like a complaint. I told myself she was just adjusting. People adjust in their own time. I was patient. I had 41 years of practice being patient. My granddaughter, Lily, was born 2 years after they moved in. She came into the world small and loud and absolutely certain that she was the most important person in any room she entered, which she was. From the moment I held her in that hospital, I understood that everything I had built had been unconsciously aimed at this, at having something worth leaving behind that was not made of concrete or wood. Lily called me Pop, not Grandpa, not Granddad, but Pop, which she had decided on herself at age 2 and which I considered the greatest title I had ever been given. She would come to my workshop in the garage and sit on a stool and watch me work, asking questions that had no real answers. Why does wood smell like that? Is the saw angry? Do nails have feelings? I answered every single one seriously, because she deserved to be taken seriously. The trouble started, as trouble usually does, gradually and then all at once. Derek's new job, he had found work as a regional sales manager for a building supply company, partly through contacts I had built over 4 decades, came with a salary that I thought would give them independence. Instead, it seemed to give Brianne permission to want more. A newer car. Vacations they posted on social media before they had finished packing. A kitchen renovation that I did not ask about but was informed of after the contractor had already been hired. I helped pay for it. Of course I did. It was my house. Derek changed alongside the money. Or maybe the money just revealed who he had always been underneath the version of himself he showed me when he needed something. He stopped asking how I was doing. He started speaking to me the way you speak to a piece of furniture you are considering replacing. Aware of it, not particularly attached to it. When I mentioned that the business had slowed down and I was thinking of retiring early, he nodded and said, "Probably a good idea," with a flatness that told me he had already been thinking about what my retirement would mean for him. I retired at 65. I sold Mercer Contracting to my project manager, a good man named Russell, for a fair price that left me comfortable but not wealthy. Comfortable meant the house was paid off. The fig tree was still growing, and I could take care of myself without asking anyone for anything. I thought that was what I had spent my life building toward. I was wrong about what it meant to them. The first conversation that I still cannot fully account for happened on a Sunday in March. I had made dinner a full roast with vegetables because Lily had asked for it, and I liked making things she asked for, and we were sitting at the table I had built myself from reclaimed oak. Brienne was on her phone throughout the meal. Derek ate without speaking. Lily told me about a bird she had seen at school that she thought might be a hawk but could also have been an eagle and was possibly both at the same time. I told her that was a reasonable position to hold. After Lily went to bed, Brienne set her phone down and said, "Harold, we've been thinking." When someone says they have been thinking, in that tone, about you, they have not been thinking. They have been deciding. The thinking was finished before you sat down. She told me that Derek's company was offering a relocation package to Nashville, a promotion, a significant raise, a house allowance. She told me they were going to take it. She told me this was an opportunity they could not pass up. And then she said the thing that changed everything. "We've been supporting you for 2 years now. We think it's time you figure out a more permanent situation." I set my fork down. I looked at my son, who was looking at the table. I said, "I'm sorry you've been supporting me," Brienne said. "The utilities, the groceries sometimes, the cost of maintaining this property. It adds up, Harold." I looked at Derek again. He said, "She's not wrong. It's a lot." I want to be careful here about what I felt in that moment, because it was not simple. There was anger, yes, but underneath the anger was something older and quieter, which was grief. Grief that I had somehow produced a man who could sit at a table I had built, in a house I had constructed with my own hands, on land I had purchased, and tell me, without flinching, that I was a burden on him. I said, "This is my house, Derek." He said, "We know, but that doesn't mean we're not contributing to it," Brienne said. "We just think it would be healthier for everyone if you found something more suited to your age. A senior community, maybe. Somewhere with people in the same situation." I was 67. I had recently reshingled my own roof. I did not raise my voice. I did not say most of what was in my mind. I told them I needed to think about it, and I went to my workshop and I sat in the dark for a long time, next to the stool where Lily liked to sit, and ask me about whether nails had feelings. I thought about my father's $12. I thought about Susan's fig tree. I thought about 41 years of early mornings and late estimates and payroll that I covered out of my own pocket twice when contracts fell through, because I was not going to let 32 families go without a paycheck because of a bureaucratic delay. And I thought about Lily. I called my attorney the next morning. His name is George Paulson, and I have known him for 30 years, and he is the kind of man who listens completely before he says anything. I told him everything. He listened. Then he said, "What do you want to do?" I told him. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That is either the most patient thing I have ever heard, or the most precise. Possibly both." I said, "I have spent 41 years being precise." Over the following 3 weeks, I made a series of moves that I had thought through carefully, that I had in fact been quietly preparing for longer than I cared to admit, because some part of me had understood for 2 years where this was heading even when I did not want to name it. I contacted the Asheville Children's Foundation, an organization I had donated to for years. I restructured my estate so that the house, my house, the one I built, the one Susan planted roses along, would pass into a trust upon my death or voluntary transfer, with 2 conditions. The first condition was that Lily, my granddaughter, would have the right to live in it or receive proceeds from it when she turned 25, with no interference from her parents. The second condition was that I retained full rights to it for as long as I chose to live there. I moved my liquid assets into accounts that Derek and Brienne had no knowledge of, because there was no reason they should have. They were not my accounts. They had never been anything to do with. I arranged for Russell, who had bought my business, to hire a trustworthy property manager to maintain the house while I was away. I packed 2 bags and my father's watch, which I kept in a box in the workshop. I called Lily's school and spoke to her teacher, a woman named Mrs. Caldwell, who I had met at 3 separate events and who I trusted. I asked Mrs. Caldwell to keep an eye on Lily in the coming weeks and to call me if anything seemed wrong. She asked me if everything was all right. I said it would be. On the morning of the last day, I made Lily's breakfast before she woke up. Oatmeal with brown sugar and sliced banana, the way she liked it. I sat with her while she ate and she told me about a dream she'd had where she lived inside a tree and the tree could walk. I told her that sounded like a fine way to live. She asked me if I was going somewhere because I had a bag by the door. I told her I was going to visit some old friends for a while. She said, "Will you come back?" I said, "I will always come back for you." She seemed to accept that the way she accepted most things completely, without needing it explained further. She kissed me on the cheek and went to brush her teeth. I sat at that oak table for another minute by myself. Then I picked up my bags and I left. I drove to Knoxville, where I have a friend named Carl who has a cabin property about 12 miles outside the city. Carl and I have known each other since we were 22 years old. He did not ask me many questions. He showed me to the guest room and told me dinner was at 6 and that there was decent fishing in the creek behind the property if I wanted it. I slept better that night than I had slept in 2 years. What happened at the house? I heard from George and from Mrs. Caldwell, and eventually from Lily herself, in pieces. Over the following weeks, Derek and Brianne returned from Nashville. They had driven up to look at properties to find that I was not there. My personal belongings were reduced. The workshop was clean and locked. Derek called my cell phone, and I let it ring. He called George, who told him politely that I had made certain arrangements and that he was not at liberty to discuss them further without my authorization. This was, apparently, when things escalated. Brianne determined that I had, in her words, gone off the deep end. Derek started telling people I was not mentally well, that I had been declining, that he was concerned for my welfare. He contacted Adult Protective Services, who sent a caseworker to Carl's address, which he had apparently gotten through means I did not fully understand. The caseworker spoke with me for 40 minutes. I was building a birdhouse in Carl's workshop when she arrived. I showed her the birdhouse. I answered her questions. She wrote something in her notepad, thanked me for my time, and left. I never heard from Adult Protective Services again. Derek hired a lawyer of his own to contest the estate restructuring. George handled it with the competence he has shown for 30 years. The house was mine. The trust was properly structured, and there was not a legal mechanism in existence that could transfer ownership of a property to someone who had no claim to it. Derek's lawyer sent 2 letters and then stopped sending letters. What my son did not anticipate, what I suspect he had genuinely never considered, was that I had receipts. 41 years of a man who built things keeps records. I had the original deed. I had every mortgage payment, every property tax filing, every utility bill for 22 years before Derek arrived. I had a ledger, maintained out of old habit, that showed every dollar I had contributed to the household during the 2 years they lived there. It was not a small number. George submitted all of it in response to the second letter from Derek's lawyer. There was no third letter. 6 weeks after I left, I received a call from Mrs. Caldwell. She told me that Lily had been coming to school quiet. Not troubled, she said, but quieter than usual. She was eating her lunch alone sometimes. She had asked Mrs. Caldwell once whether people could come back after they went away. I was in Carl's kitchen when I took that call. I set the phone on the table, and I looked out the window at the creek for a long time. Then I drove back to Asheville. I did not go to the house. I called ahead. Derek answered, and I told him I was coming to see Lily, and that if there was any obstacle to that, I would be arriving with George and a family court petition. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Fine." Lily was sitting on the porch steps when I pulled up. She was wearing her yellow raincoat even though it was not raining. She saw the truck, and she stood up, and then she ran. She hit me at approximately full speed somewhere around the midsection and held on with both arms. I picked her up and held her the way I had held her in that hospital, when she was new and small and certain she was the most important person in any room. She said, into my shoulder, "You said you'd come back." I said, "I always come back for you." We sat on the porch for 2 hours. I had brought her a painted rock from the creek behind Carl's cabin. She had told me once that she collected rocks, and she held it with both hands and examined it from every angle, as if it contained a message only she could read. Derek stood in the doorway at one point. We looked at each other for a moment. I did not speak first. He looked older than I remembered, though it had only been 6 weeks. "Some kinds of time are heavier than others," he said. "We're still going to Nashville." I said, "All right." He said, "I don't know what you expected to accomplish." I said, "I expected to protect what matters." He went back inside. The legal matter concluded the way George had told me from the beginning it would conclude, in my favor, fully and without conditions. The house remained mine. The trust for Lily remained intact. Derek and Brianne moved to Nashville in June with their things and their relocation package and their new kitchen appliances, which they took with them, and which were not theirs to take, but which I decided were not worth contesting. Before they left, Brianne came to the workshop where I was finishing a small cabinet. She stood in the doorway. She said, "I want you to know, I don't think you handled this well." I sanded the edge I was working on. I said, "All right." She said, "Lily is going to grow up without her grandfather close by because of the choice you made." I set the sandpaper down. I said, "Lily is going to grow up knowing that her grandfather is a man who doesn't abandon the people he loves." That seemed more important. She left without responding. Derek came to say goodbye to me on the morning of the move. He stood on the porch with his hands in his pockets and looked at the yard and did not look at me. He said, "I just want you to know, I never thought it would go this far." I said, "I know you didn't." I meant that. I believed it. He had not thought it would go this far because he had not been thinking about me at all. That was the truth of it. Not cruelty. Absence. He had stopped seeing me as a person whose choices carried the same weight as his own. I had become part of the background of his life, like the house, like the garden, something that was simply there, something he had come to believe would absorb whatever was done to it without changing. He was wrong. I had spent 41 years learning what I could absorb and what I could not, and I had learned it the hard way, the only way anything important is ever learned. He drove away at 8 in the morning. I watched the truck until it turned at the end of the road and was gone. I went to the garden. The roses Susan had planted needed serious attention after 2 years of neglect. I had the tools and the time and nowhere else to be. I spent the morning cutting back the dead growth and turning the soil and finding, under the overgrowth near the south fence, that the fig tree had survived all of it. More than survived. It had put out new growth along 3 branches that I had assumed were finished. Susan had planted that tree. She had waited 4 years for it to give her a single piece of fruit. And when it did, she had called me outside at 7 in the morning to look at it like it was something miraculous. I understood then, in a way I could not have explained to anyone who had not lived it, that survival is not passive. The fig tree had not been waiting. It had been growing the whole time, quietly, in the direction of whatever light it could find, putting out roots nobody could see, building toward a morning when someone would finally come back to tend it. I pulled on my gloves and I got to work. Lily calls me every Sunday now from Nashville. She is 7 years old and she has the telephone manner of a senior executive, direct, thorough, not interested in small talk. She tells me about her week in complete sentences. She tells me about the birds she sees in the new yard, whether they might be hawks or eagles or possibly both simultaneously. She asks when she can come visit and I tell her any time. And I mean it with everything I have. My house is standing. The garden is coming back. The fig tree is alive. I am Harold Mercer. I am 67 years old. I built every single thing that matters to me with my own 2 hands, and I will tell you the same thing I would tell any man who has watched the people he loved the most look right through him like he was furniture. You are not furniture. You never were. And it is never too late to remind the world of that in the quietest, most permanent way you know how.